Hello and welcome to topic 9 of the British Canoeing Online Core Coach. My name is Matt Giblin. I'm a coach educator and leader provider across multiple disciplines. And in this topic, I'm going to look at coaches' decision making. Now, no matter what craft we coach from or what environment we operate in, there are some commonalities. At the heart of it is decision making. The environments we often work in are hyperdynamic. This means that they are ever changing and we're constantly having to balance elements of safety, fun, and what's best for the learner or athlete. As coaches, we're often presented with complex situations, be that weather, conditions, or even the group dynamics. We're also dealing with people. So as we discovered earlier in the course, the learners and the athletes are the most important part of the coaching process. So making appropriate decisions which keep them safe and allow them to have fun, but also to develop themselves is vitally important. Now, we make lots of decisions as coaches. And what I've tried to do in this next section is just break down some of those areas which might help us to focus our thinking about decision making. Firstly, we've got the who. Who is it that we're coaching? What are their motivations? What are the reasons for being here? What are the goals or the aspirations that they have? And is the learning environment suitable to meet those goals and aspirations? The best way to get this information, as we've already discussed, is to think about the wants and the needs of the students that we're working with. What? As we discussed again in the planning topic, this is all dependent on what the students' wants and needs are. The decisions we make here can have a massive effect on the learner's experience and on their development. Things to consider here are performance models and the progressions that we go through in order to get the students to where they want to be. Why? What is it that's directing us? Is it an internal or is it an external influence? I always ask myself, why? Why am I doing this? Why is it working? And also, why is it not working? And why have I made decisions like getting a member of the group to close their eyes? If the idea is that it's something that I've seen on a course or something that I've seen someone else do, then maybe we need to ask ourselves, is it the best thing for that student? Or are we just trying to repeat something we've seen somewhere else? If you ever ask yourself the question, why? And the answer is, I don't know. Well, maybe there's some reflection that needs to happen there, or maybe you need to rethink how it is you're approaching that session. How? How am I going to meet the learner's aims and objectives? How am I going to get the most out of the time I have with them? And how am I going to prepare them to be adaptable performers who can be independent and safe? When? What are the observational cues that we're receiving? These are going to really influence when it's time to change things, when it's time to give the next bit of feedback, when it's time to ask the next question. These are all questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to decide when it's appropriate to do the things that we want to do. Finally, we've got where. For me, venue choice is one of the most important elements. It could be too challenging, or it could be not challenging enough. But if we make the wrong decision here, it can have a detrimental effect to our learners. Other things we have to think about for the where is, does it have enough variety? So the venue that we've chosen, is there enough going on? And are there enough opportunities to enable the learners to get out of the session what they need? Now, I understand that sometimes that can be a difficult thing. Maybe we have a certain venue that we always use, either a work venue or maybe it's part of a club. And in those situations, we need to really think about how we can adapt and make the most of that particular stretch of water that we've got. If possible, we're going to try and think about how we can change those and maybe how we can pick a different venue that's going to help get the most out of the session for the students. So what does the theory say about decision making? Well, in essence, it breaks decision making down into two parts. We've got the classical decision making process. So that's what is often known as slow time thinking. So this is the sort of stuff that happens when you've got time and space to think about the decisions that you're going to make and really mull over the consequences of those decisions. I'll give some examples here. So looking at session planning, well, that's definitely something that would happen. in a classical fashion. But then we've also got other factors such as looking at the tides and looking at the weather and seeing if those things are going to influence and affect the day that we've got ahead of us. At the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got the naturalistic decision-making processes. So these are those things that happen in fast time. When we don't have the luxury of time and space like we do when we're thinking about the classical end, this could be to do with decision-making around incident management. So there's a problem and we need to solve it. Or we need to think on the fly. We need to think really dynamically about what we're doing. This is also very, very appropriate for when we're working with groups. It's great to think at the classical end that we can plan a session. And as we've talked about during the session planning exercise, planning is great, but it has its limitations. If we do all our pre-prepared plans beforehand and then enforce those onto the students, well, that's not exactly meeting the students' needs. That's us doing what we want to do with them. So in this naturalistic decision-making framework, then what we're thinking about is observing what's going on, making some decisions, asking ourselves some of those questions that we've talked about previously: who, what, when, where, how, why, and then making choices that is going to get the best out of that student at that moment in time. So like I've said, incident management's a really good one. When there's a problem, how are we going to fix it? But then also changing our plans based on the needs and what's going on at that particular moment in time. It's really important when we think about naturalistic decision making that it's predominantly built on our experiences. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we generating our experience? Are we getting opportunities to work in different venues with different people who want to look at different elements of coaching? Maybe are we getting the opportunity to observe other coaches? All these opportunities to find ourselves in novel and new situations that can often be challenging are a really good way of us generating our experience, so that when we do need to make decisions dynamically, we're able to do that. If we're only ever used to reading off a session plan, it will make the naturalistic decision-making process really hard when we've got somebody in front of us who is struggling or who can't quite find the key to the bit that they want to work on. If we've experienced lots of different things, well, then we've probably got lots of ideas, and then we can share those ideas with the student or design practice in a way that's going to help them to develop the solution for themselves. Another part of the decision-making process is known as heuristics. And as it says on the slide here, heuristics are often called a rule of thumb. The fancy way is we can say there are cognitive shortcuts that can be used as an alternative to time-consuming classical decision-making. But I know that's a bit of a mouthful, so let's break that down for a moment and just think about it. The cognitive shortcut element is basically you not needing to do as much processing, not need to think as much, because you've got a solution that works for you. Maybe it's something that you've previously experienced. Now we can ask ourselves, are heuristics a good or a bad thing? And it's really difficult to try and label things as being good or bad. But in this next slide, we look at the pros and the cons of heuristics. So some of the good things about them is that they can save us time. If we've experienced something before, if we've seen it before, well, then we might have a solution that can help in that particular moment. So maybe an example could be somebody's paddling forwards and they struggle to keep the boat in a straight line. Well, looking at our observation analysis, you'll focus a lot more on that in your discipline-specific modules. But if we look and we observe and we start to notice things, well, then based on this heuristic observation, this heuristic decision-making, we might decide, right, I've seen this before. Last time I saw this, it was this. Therefore, let's try this. So I think you can all probably think of an example where you've seen someone performing and they're struggling. We've got choices at that point. We can give them an answer, or we can create some practice. We can design some practice that is going to allow them to generate the information for themselves. When we look at the next module to do with the structure and practice, we look at skill acquisition, and we also look at how we can organize our practice in a way that helps the student to generate answers for themselves. But back to heuristics. One thing, it can save us time. It can free up our brain power because if we've experienced it already before, those little shortcuts we can make mean that we don't have to be constantly thinking and processing lots of information. One of the good things is decisions are often based on our previous experience. Like we've discussed before, our previous experience can be a good or a bad thing. It can be positive or it can be negative, or it can be useful or useless. It all depends how we generate that experience and then what we do with that experience after we've generated it. On the con side of things, heuristics often give us what we call a suboptimal outcome. It's not the best. Most of the time when we're making decisions, because we're operating in this hyperdynamic environment, well then the decisions that we make are often a little less than perfect. And most of the time that's okay. Because if we're doing a little bit of coaching and we set some practice up based on some decisions that we've made and it doesn't quite work, well, as long as that person doesn't get hurt or injured, it's okay. Because actually the process of them coming across that stumbling block can often be something really useful for their development. Point 2 is decisions are based on previous experience. And as we've said there, this previous experience can lead to a bias, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The downside to experience is that if we don't get it right, and if we don't generate the appropriate experience, it can really hinder what we're doing. There's lots of good research out there about experience, and what we'll do is we'll put together a little bit of a resource pack. So if you want to look at developing experience and things around heuristic decision making, especially around heuristic observations, we're going to include those in the resources in this module. We've just talked about a bias. So heuristic bias, or sometimes known as a heuristic trap, are there, and they're something that we can fall foul of. And if we fall foul of these things, it can often not be useful for ourselves, and it can often not be useful for our students as well, for our learners. So there's lots of different heuristic biases out there. I'm going to highlight a few, but feel free to do some research to look at the others that are available. So one of them is familiarity. So familiarity we think would be a good thing, but in some cases familiarity can be a trap because we go into that moment and we make some decisions about those things based on those previous experiences we've talked a lot about already. For example, if we went to a river and we got on the Monday and we had a great day out and it was good levels, there were no obstacles, there were no fallen trees, nothing to catch us out, well then we might go again on the Tuesday, and because we're familiar with the venue, or we've used it a lot, or maybe only used it the day before, we might get caught up in the trap of thinking, well, it was okay yesterday, so it's probably going to be okay today. That can be a real problem for us. Another example is that we could get to a beach on our way to our favorite rock hopping venue or our favorite tide race, but today things are a little bit different. So we go there every single week as part of the club trip, and I love coaching at this venue. But today the wind direction is slightly different. There's a bit more swell. Maybe it's something I'm not quite used to. Now all these things start to stack up. And as we get further and further into the trip, the conditions that we notice at the start that we put to one side because we know the venue so well could cause a problem for our students, because it might end up being too challenging. And it might also mean that they have difficulties and they don't get as much out of the practice as we hope for. So we've got to be really careful about falling into familiarity as a heuristic bias or heuristic trap. Commitment. Now, we think that commitment should be a positive thing. However, commitment to having a dedicated plan, or maybe we've traveled a long way, maybe we're on a club trip, and we've made a 3 or 4 hour journey to a venue to use that. If conditions aren't right and things aren't going quite as we planned, we might feel that because we're committed to it, because people have spent time planning it, they've spent money on accommodation, all those sort of different things, or maybe someone's booked you for a coaching session and they've traveled all the way up or all the way down from somewhere far away, and we're thinking it's not quite appropriate today, but because everybody's committed to this plan, well then we might fall foul of that, and we might find ourselves in a scenario where we're endangering our students, our learners, or maybe endangering ourselves. Social proof's a really interesting one, because what happens with social proof is that we look around at what others are doing. So we could be on the sea again, we could be at a rock gardening venue, a rock hopping venue, and one or more members of the group take on a challenge. So maybe we've decided to set up a little challenge, and we're working on some decision making, working on some tactical work in and around the rocks. And some of these guys decide to get involved in a challenge. It'd be really easy for our students to fall into that trap of saying, well, if they did it, then I can do it. And that's not always the case. So we've got to be really aware of our students falling into these heuristic traps when we're coaching. But we've also got to be aware of us falling into them, because we might see a team of people coaching at a venue on the river, and they might be working a particular area, and we see them using that area. So it could be that there's a really nicely playing stopper there, and it looks great. And that team that are operating in there, and the coach that's doing some work with them, is looking like everything's really safe and under control. So we make an assumption that if they're playing in that hole, it's okay for us to go and do it. What we're not necessarily taking into account is the fact that this could be day 5 of some continuous coaching with that same team, and they might have built up to this point and we're coming in fresh. So we've got to be really careful that just because somebody else is doing something, it doesn't necessarily mean it's safe or appropriate for us to be doing. I suppose this can also translate to some coaching methods and some coaching behaviors. Just because some people use our method or our behavior doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate for us to use. So we've got to be really careful that we pick the right tools for the right job based on ours, and also, more importantly, the students' needs. Scarcity. So scarcity is a really big one, because lots of people, especially nowadays, lead very busy lives. So they might commit to something, and they might decide we're going to go and do something or engage in some coaching, and things again aren't quite right for us, or they want to do a little challenge, they want to go off for a paddle around a headland, or they want to take a sup trip on the coast. And as a result of that, they might say, I never get to get out, conditions are never good enough for me, so I want to go and do it today. And they get involved in the activity, and as part of our coaching, we're trying to do our best to support them, but things aren't quite right. And as a result of things being a bit scarcer for them, so the opportunities aren't always there, we might be falling into a bit of a trap there of helping them or not helping them to achieve this highly prized goal that they've got. We've got to be really careful that we monitor those things. It's very similar to commitment in that point. The expert halo. So someone in the group has got a little bit more experience, is a bit more assertive. Maybe the rest of the group look at you as a experienced or maybe even an inexperienced coach. And just because you've got that label, certain assumptions are made about you as the coach, but also maybe about different members of the group as well. So the trap here is that the person might not be as good as everyone thinks they are, and they might blindly follow that person, when maybe the better decision is to think about it, have a conversation, and make some decisions as part of a team. We've got to be really careful that people will view us as the coach as an expert of some sorts. And I think if we ever get ourselves into a situation where we're not quite comfortable with what's going on, we need to be very clear that this is beyond our expertise, this is beyond our experience, beyond our knowledge level. It's much better to say to somebody, this is something I don't feel comfortable with or I can't do, than to go along with it and worry that people will make a judgment. Because if something does happen and there is an accident, well, then we've got to be really careful about the responsibility that we take on. Also, from a coaching point of view, we've got to be really aware that people will listen to what we've got to say, and they will do things that we ask them to do because They see us as the expert. So we need to make sure that we're doing things that are appropriate, but also things that are safe for the team. So there's a list of some. There are many, many, many heuristic traps that we can fall into. And there's lots and lots of research. Again, we'll compile that and we'll put it in as a little resource pack for you as part of this module. So next session, what we're going to do is we're going to make some time to discuss some of the things we've talked about during this video. It should be a really good opportunity for us to put some things into context and think about how we use decision making within the coaching process. So I've got some homework for you. Before next session, I want you to think about what challenges you faced regarding decision making during a coaching session. So it could be a one-off, or it could be as part of a series of long-term coaching sessions. But what are the challenges that you faced? Are you aware of ever having fallen into a heuristic bias or heuristic trap? Is there anything that's ever come up where you've gone, ooh, that actually chimes with something that happened to me when I was delivering some coaching, or possibly when I was being coached? And the final thing is, I want you to share some decisions that on reflection you could have done better. And really importantly, I would like to discuss the why. So when you're with your tutor for the next part of this decision-making topic, they're going to ask you for some of the answers to some of these things. So please come prepared so we can have a full discussion about it, and hopefully it'll be useful for every member of the group. If you're looking for some further research, the British Canoeing Awarding Body website has a section called the Digital Library, and it's a really good resource. If you just type in what you're looking for, that will come up. Yeah, you'll be able to find those things. There's a couple of good books. So Thinking Fast and Slow is a very good book. You can pick that up from Amazon. And then there's a podcast, the Essential Adventure Sport podcast, with a chap called Dr. Lol Collins, and that episode is all about decision making. So if you want to go and have a listen, something that you can listen to while you're driving along, go and check that out. But like I said before, we're going to put a little set of resources below so you can access those and do some reading in your own time.